Well, good evening, everyone. I'm John Ravenhill. I have the privilege of being the director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you this evening to this special event. The Balsillie School engages in three main types of activities. First, we teach high-quality graduate programs in global governance and in international public policy on behalf of our two university partners. Secondly, we run a very active program of events, about 120 each year, and the vast majority of these events are open to the public. We welcome your participation in these. We'd love to have you as part of our community. You will have seen in the slideshow earlier the school's website address. There's a link there for signing up to our weekly bulletin, which comes to you through email. Please do so if you're interested in becoming part of our community. Thirdly, we do cutting-edge research. And for the purposes of trying to make it clear where we concentrate our activities, we formed ourselves into 6 research clusters. And these are listed on this banner, which I hope we might be able to focus on. Yay, okay. Otherwise you need binoculars to read them. And the cluster that's responsible for this evening's event is the Environment and Resources Research Cluster. I'm particularly grateful to Dr. Audra Mitchell, the CG Chair in Global Governance and Ethics at Wilfrid Laurier University, and to Dr. Tad Homer-Dixon, the CG Chair of Global Systems at the University of Waterloo, for all of their work in organizing the event. And they've been very ably assisted by Clay De Silva, one of our PhD students who you saw starring in the video just a few minutes ago. He's here somewhere. There he is, okay. In a week when our southern neighbors, curiously it seems, have elected a president who has threatened to tear up the nuclear deal with Iran and to withdraw from the Paris Agreement on greenhouse gas emissions, then there is surely no more appropriate topic than the subject of this evening's talk. That is, tipping point for planet Earth. I will now hand things over to Dr. Audra Mitchell to introduce our distinguished speakers for the evening, and I'm sure you will give them a very warm welcome. Please enjoy.
Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you to all of you for coming out to join us this evening. It's really wonderful to see so many of you, especially since many of us are still processing the events of earlier this week. So my name is Audra Mitchell, and I'm the CG Chair in Global Governance and Ethics here at the Balsillie School. And it's my pleasure tonight to welcome two of the world's most distinguished environmental scientists, Professor Elizabeth Hadley and Professor Tony Barnosky. Elizabeth Hadley is the Paul S. and Billy Achilles Professor of Environmental Biology at Stanford University and a Senior Fellow of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. Liz has conducted extensive research throughout North and South America on evolution, ecology, and the evolution of vertebrates. She is especially interested in the biogeographic history of mammals around the world, most recently working in India and Costa Rica, so this is a whole other area of international studies. Professor Hadley has published widely on a range of issues, including the effects of climate change on species habitat, grand challenges for science and society, extinction events, and ecology. Tony Barnosky is Professor Emeritus at the Department of Integrative Biology at the University of California, Berkeley, and is presently Executive Director of the Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve at Stanford University, of which Liz is the Faculty Director. Tony studies how changes in the physical environment, such as climate change and mountain building, contribute to the evolution of mammals, species, and faunas. He's authored numerous influential articles and books highlighting issues related to extinction, population, and ecological collapse, including the recent book Dodging Extinction, which, if you haven't read it, is a great introduction to some of the catastrophes the world is now facing. Tony has also played a very important role in bringing the concept of the Anthropocene into public and policy-making discourses. Together, Tony and Liz have worked for decades to bridge the gap between cutting-edge science and innovative global governance. Their work addresses many key governance challenges, many of those that we're concerned with here at the BSIA. Those include food security, the economic consequences of extinction, and scenarios for the possible futures of the planet. Their influential work is the subject of a recent documentary entitled Demain, or Tomorrow, which hopefully we'll hear a little bit about in just a few minutes. While their research and science advocacy has influenced policy making at the highest levels, both nationally and internationally. So tonight, Tony and Liz are going to talk to us about their new co-authored book, Tipping Points for Planet Earth: How Close Are We to the Edge? The book examines how the Earth will cope with the estimated 10 billion humans that will inhabit it by 2050. It tackles massive complex problems such as the challenge of guaranteeing water and food security, meeting energy needs, protecting biodiversity, and managing climate change. Crucially, Tony and Liz ask whether global society and systems of governance can withstand these massive changes, and indeed when that tipping point might be reached. But the book also offers insight into the narrow window of opportunity left to make substantial changes in global politics, governance, and economics in order to avoid collapse. So I think we can look forward to some hope at the end of what often seems to be a fairly dark tunnel. So with no further ado, please help me in welcoming Professors Liz Hadley and Tony Barnosky.
So thank you guys for coming, and I want to say this is going to be a tag team talk, so I'm going to start out and then Tony's going to take over midway here. It is a really unusual time to be here. When I accepted this, I really didn't think about this timing being right after Election Day. And until I saw Tad this morning, we had not spoken with anyone since the election results. We were up all night, and then our plane left San Francisco at 6 o'clock in the morning. The only people we had talked to were flight attendants and people, handling our passports. You are really the first audience that we've spoken with, and I have to tell you, as a scientist, but mostly as a person, this has really rocked us to the core, and I'm not alone in saying that. The very first thing I want to do is really describe a little bit of the arc of how the book came to be and how a scientist who really specializes on the ecology and evolution of mammals mostly has come to go to the White House to talk about climate change and to write a book. I start off with this, and I want to welcome especially the first-year students who are here, or maybe who are in the spillover room, because you guys are so important. It's so important for you to engage. The world is changing so fast. Anything you do, even right now, matters. So thanks for coming. Freshmen are we call them freshmen. Our freshmen are my absolute favorite group of students to teach. So this image, I don't know how many of you followed Commander Scott Kelly on Twitter, but he was an active tweeter when he was an astronaut on the space station. And this image is one of my favorites. It's been on my screensaver for quite a while. And the reason I like this is because, he took it, but it views, kind of important things. It reminds me of the vastness of space. I mean, the edge of time. It's so massive. It's so hard to comprehend. And yet, equally engaging on this photo is the Earth. Many astronauts have commented on how thin and how fragile our atmosphere is. But even more important and dominating this picture is the fact that the lights of humans are essentially equivalent to the lights of the planetary, the universe. And so it reminds me that we're the only planet that we have. And I know that's a little bit of a cliche, but another thing I'd like you to read here with me: you develop an instant global consciousness, a people orientation, an intense dissatisfaction with the state of the world, and a compulsion to do something about it. From out there on the moon, international politics looks so petty. You want to grab a politician by the scruff of the neck and drag him 250,000 miles out and say, "Look at that, you son of a bitch." So this quote was by an astronaut who died this year, and this guy is kind of crazy in some ways. I mean, he talks about aliens, he's done all sorts of things. He tried to communicate through his mind to people on the planet when he was in space. So he's an interesting man, to say the least. But this quote seemed particularly opportune for today, in that really it's an important thing to have a planetary perspective right now. So I want to tell you a little bit of a personal story for me, is how I came to be someone communicating to an audience like you. I am a pretty isolated, kind of quiet person, which is hard for some people to believe, but my favorite time of life was working in the backcountry of Yellowstone National Park, where I worked for a long time. And one of the questions I was addressing was how the modern ecosystem came to be. I was excavating some fossil localities there. I was the first paleontologist to work in Yellowstone. It was on the northern border of the park here, so this is kind of a neat view of Yellowstone Lake. And I was invited by the park superintendent at the time, the year was 1988, to go and visit Silvertip Ranch. Silvertip Ranch is outside the park's northern boundary. It's kind of surrounded by wilderness area, the Absarica Beartooth Wilderness on one side and the national park on the other. But the people who go to Silvertip Ranch don't go through either of those places to get there. They generally are helicoptered in. This is a very exclusive place. We were met by a man in a smoking jacket and velvet slippers when we got there. There was every kind of rod you could imagine for fly fishing, and it was a remarkable journey. I was asked by the superintendent to go with him to hike up there and talk about my work in the northern part of Yellowstone. And I think he was thinking good neighbors, maybe some money for the Park Service. We walked up to this place. It's a 13-mile hike. So the superintendent, the chief of research at the time, John Varley, so Bob Barbie was his name. By the end of the summer, his name became Barbecue. But this summer, I walked with Bob Barbie and John Varley up these 13 miles to get to this ranch. And it was the only time in my life where I had packed pearls and high heels in my backpack. And the reason was to give a talk here. And as we were hiking up, this is Slough Creek Valley, so this is what you hike up to get to Silvertip. Quite an incredibly beautiful place, renowned among, I don't know if any of you are fly fishermen, but this is a renowned place for fly fishing. We looked back, and what we saw was something along the lines of this. We saw a firestorm, and Bob Barbie looked back and he said, "I think my life is about to change for the rest of the summer." And indeed, he was right. So on the right here, on the right what you see is Yellowstone Park, and then everything in red burned in 1988. So Silvertip Ranch is up here on the northern part of the park, and what you see is a vast percentage of Yellowstone burned that year. It completely changed the landscape. It completely changed the way it looked and the way it acted. Since 1988, it was a watershed year. Since 1988, in the western United States, wildfires have doubled in frequency and intensity. So here what you see is an image of, 5 million years. Note there's scale breaks at every time one of these vertical lines. So 5 million to 500,000, then 10,000, 2,000, 150 years before present, and then here you go into the future. And one of the reasons why the paleo record has turned out to be so illustrative in thinking about our future is because it gives us a context and a scale by which to think about what does 1 degree really mean? What does 2 degrees really mean? What you see here is essentially temperature. 5 million years, then we have the advent of the ice ages and the Pleistocene, the Holocene. This period of time, the last 10,000 or so years, is basically, that's when our civilizations evolved all around the world. Our civilizations, our coping mechanisms, our cultures are all adapted to the last 10,000 years of relative constant environmental temperatures. We evolved, we came out of Africa somewhere around here, okay? And then you end up with future projections far outside the temperature boundaries of the last 5 million, in fact, the last 14 million years. So these temperatures that we're headed to, that you guys, especially you first-year students, are headed to in your lifetimes, are greater than our species have ever experienced on the planet. And they're greater than most of the mammal species, most of the ecosystems that you see on the planet have ever experienced in their time. An average mammal is around 2 to 5 million years. A mammal species survives that long. So we're talking about really significant changes over the time scale in which we have evolved and as our cultures have evolved. So part of the studies that I do and part of the changes that I saw starting in 1988 and continuing to now in Yellowstone is to try and understand what species, in fact, are doing on the planet in response to climate change. So using the past as a way to help us understand what's happening now and to make predictions for the future. And one of the things we know in the Pleistocene is that there are species, this is a great example of a species that responds exactly the way you think it should, that as climates warm, they move north. This is the northern bog lemming, this animal was found at all of these black dots during the Pleistocene, greater than around 12,000 years ago. And so you can see it occupied the lower 48, and now it's pretty much a northern species. So it did what animals do. They contract, they follow their climates, they follow their habitats, and this animal did exactly what you expect. So we're still we're trying to see now and document what's happening to animals today. And that took me to Nepal. So I have a graduate student looking at the Asian pika species. For those of you who have hiked in the high elevation regions of America, you've seen these pikas. They're related to rabbits and hares. This is a pika from Asia. These animals they have a physiology that doesn't allow them to deal with temperatures over 75 degrees Fahrenheit. They're just taxed. They have a very high metabolic rate. Their resting temperature is about 104. And so they just don't tolerate those high temperatures. In Asia, they're contracting their range. They're moving up in elevation. But the issue about Asia, which is so interesting, is that they have this vast Tibetan plateau in this part of Asia to occupy. So unlike in the continental US and in North America, where as you go up in elevation, you get smaller and smaller areas, which mean with animals, that means you're gonna have fewer and fewer individuals. In Asia, they have more and more room to occupy. Good news for pikas, right? It turns out the answer is no, not so good, and this is a whole nother story, and the reason is because at 15,000 feet elevation, you don't have a lot of oxygen. So these guys have a very high resting body temperature, they don't hibernate, they consume a lot of energy, and there's not a lot of oxygen to help them do that. So we're working on those evolutionary adaptations. So as we worked in this region, it's very hard work because we don't have a lot of oxygen and there are no roads, there's no way to get up there, no beasts of burden except by hiking. And so you hike days and days, you drive for a long time on terrible roads, and then you hike with all of your equipment on your back. And really beautiful place. This is where the red panda lives. This is the kind of the last bastion of the red panda, which is endangered and quite a lovely animal. So we spent time in these Himalayas. And what we found, though, is that people are living up there. They're living really high in the Himalayas. This family actually, this woman and her daughter, what they do is they open these tea houses to you, so you can go and you can spend the night. They'll cook beans, and dal bhat is what it's called in Nepal. It's just beans and rice. And this is what another tea house looked outside the back. So here they are. These are the Himalayas, spectacular scenery. This is just short of tree line in this case. And what you'll notice, though, is that these trees that you saw, they don't have any branches on them. So red pandas, for example, live in the high canopy of these trees, and they use this as cover. And it turns out, we found this by just observing. Turns out, but what happens is the young kids, mostly young boys, every day go from the high above tree line elevations in which their little families are living, and they go down to where trees are, and they shimmy up these trees, and they cut branches off the trees, these giant knives called the kukri knives, and every day they carry the wood up to where, after the end of the day, they carry the wood up to their families. And that wood is what allowed us to eat. This is what they use for cooking. This is the inside of the tea house of the woman I just showed you. She and her daughter are breathing this. This is a wood stove. There's no power. They don't have lights, so when the sun goes down, you go to bed. Except they have this thing outside. So here you see her perched place way above tree line. There's distant Himalayas. Probably you recognize this is a little solar panel. Came up on her back. And all day long, she moves it around to follow the sun, and this charges cell phones. This charges her cell phone, her son's cell phone, and the cell phone of my grad student and myself. So one of the things this made me realize is that these people, I mean, it seems so obvious to those of you who have been working in the environment, but there I was working on pikas, and it just seems so obvious. These people are living close to the edge. In the book, I describe a fight with those kukris that is all about this wood, and you'll have to read it to find out. It's quite a dramatic event that I witnessed there. So this is the kind of the beginning of, there are many different versions of this story and these examples of what our fieldwork has done, but it got us into thinking about writing a book and conveying, bearing witness to the places in the planet we've been and trying to convey why they all are basically symptoms of the same issue. And that's the source of this book. So in the book, we focus on each one of these issues, past, present, people, stuff, storms, toxins, et cetera, and importantly, what we do is try and convey the synergies between these issues and why they have led the planet to a tipping point. So what is a tipping point? It sounds like most of you who have been here and this incredible resource you have here, we've had such a good time talking to the students and the faculty here. It's amazing. Sounds like you probably know more about tipping points than most audiences we talk to, but basically it's when a threshold state is crossed and the system moves to a new state. A really easy example is an egg falling off the edge of a counter. And I'll just leave it at that. We can talk about that more if you want. So what are tipping points in the biologic, in the environment that matter? And big tipping points are mass extinction events. Mass extinction events just basically rewrite everything on the planet, all sorts of functions. They don't change physical laws, but they change the players. They change how energy is moved through the biota. So we've had 5 big mass extinctions on the planet in the last 500 million years, and most people would suggest we're going into the 6th. So the key thing, we lose a lot of species, and that's really important, and we care about the species we've lost, but the key thing to remember is that the system, it's not just a loss of 1 or 2 species in these mass extinction events. It takes millions of years for evolution to recover that biodiversity. So biodiversity, it can be snuffed out in an instant. Extinction happens really fast, but the recovery of biodiversity takes evolutionary time. It takes the rates of mutations, adaptations, interactions, and that takes millions of years. So we know these events are pretty dramatic. So one of the things that's happening now is that forest losses are a tipping point. So this is an X-ray taken by a colleague of mine, Greg Asner, who works at the Carnegie Center for Global Ecology. And what he has showed in this X-ray of an area outside Pinnacles National Monument or National Park now in California is he showed that by taking this X-ray image of these trees, this was last year, he predicted that we would have mass mortality of millions of trees. And indeed, all of those trees in red are projected to die. It's only the ones in blue that will survive. And forests are like the coral reefs of the land. We always call coral reefs like the Amazonian rainforest of the sea, but they're incredibly important because they're structurally diverse, and that means they absorb and can contain more species and more interactions. So we are already on the way of losing 70 million trees. Going to Yosemite National Park this year, it's phenomenal how many trees are dead, and not from fire, but from the combination of drought and beetle kill. And it's happening in Canada too. It happens instantly, it happens so fast. We have lost trees from Mexico all the way to the tip of Alaska through this combined synergy in the last decade through the combination of drought and pathogens. So the boreal forests. I've mentioned to a few people, Tony and I spent a month last year just driving from Seattle all the way up to the Yukon in Alaska, and just observing and learning as much as we could as ecologists. And the boreal forest in the world of ecology are known as the forest. And it's the largest land-based biome in the world. Everything in green on this map over here is the boreal forest. You probably are all familiar with it because it's in your neck of the woods. It's just a phenomenal resource and an incredible place for diversity. The diversity isn't year-round though, right? Climates change here. It turns out that boreal forests are the critical breeding environment for almost all songbirds in the Americas. 3 to 5 million birds migrate from the boreal forest down to Costa Rica, where I handle animals like this warbler in the winter. So they go down and winter in places like Costa Rica. We think about, this has got huge management challenges, right? To think about this dynamic that these land-based ecosystems are providing to migrating species. And migrations are basically disassembling the world around because of that. But these boreal forests are threatened. In Canada, the mountain pine beetle, I just mentioned this, but probably many of you know that the big outbreak between 2002 and 2011, everything you see in red is dead, everything you see in yellow is dying. This is British Columbia here. It's also anthropogenic disturbance. Everything you see as red is some sort of road or infrastructure or urban environment. So Canada's getting exploited, colonized, and changed very rapidly. And then wildfires. The year that we did our drive, we were basically trying to run ahead of fires. By the time we left British Columbia, there was a new fire being ignited every 15 minutes in British Columbia. And of course, you know about the fires from the last summer. So there were more fires last year in Canada than ever recorded. And this is a distribution of from the 1st of January to the 10th of September, a distribution of their size scaled by the size of the circle and where they were in Canada. This is not something that we have seen. It's happening all over Russia and Siberia as well. Now, this is more than just an environmental issue. These kind of changes are also affecting us economically. China, it turns out, is the largest buyer of Canadian timber, and British Columbia alone has lost 60% of its harvestable timber from the mountain pine beetle. So this is a big shift economically, and planning for the future becomes more difficult when you have these unexpected environmental events. Climate change costs money. So what you see here are a set of events, natural catastrophes, and here for scale are geophysical events, which have a pretty constant background. These are earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions. They're reasonably constant from 1980 to 2012. But everything else, you see green is meteorological events like storms, you see hydrological events like floods and debris flows, mass movements, and then in orange you see climatological events like extreme temperatures, drought, or forest fires. These things are increasing in frequency and intensity, and you can darn well bet the insurance industry knows a lot about that. Drought leads to an increased cost for wildfire prevention. Last year in California, the drought cost the state $3 billion. And this year, the Sobranes fire, which is still smoldering, is one of the largest US wildfires in history. It cost over $230 million to handle. So these are big economic issues as well. We know that global ecosystem services and ecosystems in general are disappearing. This is a map that's kind of been changed from John Foley's original map about human agricultural impacts. But this shows that about 51% of the land area of the planet has been converted in some way for human use. And 83% of the planet already, we know, has been impacted by humans. The reason why this particular image matters, you think 51%, and this by itself could lead to tipping points, it's over half, barely, but it's over half, is that look at where we have remaining areas. We have the Amazon and we have the Congo, two of the largest, most biodiverse places on the planet. Then we have these hard to reach Arctic areas that are not easy to think about farming or having people live. Or we have the Sahara. We have the Saudi Arabian desert, we have the Mongolia, the Gobi desert, the Australian desert. So these are not easy places. The Atacama, the driest place on earth. These are not easy places to think about producing food in. And so the important issue here is it's not so much the percentage, but the vast majority of arable land has already been in some way co-opted for human use. And then of course, we have the elephant in the room, right? Population growth is remarkable, and it is a big driver behind, not the only driver, but a big driver behind a lot of these global issues. So from 1950 to the present here, we have, population growth. And this, when I first saw this from the UN, it was hard for me to believe. I had to go back and keep looking at it. If we were to keep our population growth rates right now, the way they are, and just project that into the future, you're on the red line. You're on the red line. You're headed up to 27 billion people on the planet. Now, everyone who studies population knows that most countries are leveling off. They're coming down, right? And so look at the numbers, though. I mean, just to average just a half a child above replacement, which is somewhere on the order of about 2, you're still headed for a pretty darn high population growth by the year 2100, over 15 billion people. It's only if we manage to really reduce fertility rates that we'll even come close to the 9 or 10 billion people that people are projecting in the near future. So we know we're going to have a lot more people that we have to feed. And that by itself creates a lot of discomfort, unrest, and somewhere, they have to come from somewhere, and indeed they are. We could talk about population growth rates, where they're coming from, but all these people need resources. They all need food, they need water, they need shelter, and all of that comes somehow from the planet. We need farmland. This is an image of just taking a snapshot of Africa, where a lot of the population growth rates have not come down and where the Green Revolution really hasn't had a major impact at this point. This is taking the farmland that's presently in Africa, and what you see in red is a decrease of the farmland's production because of climate change. In green, you see an increase, and basically a place where we have to go and start producing food in order to keep food production the same. With new climates. And in orange, we see also a decrease in production. So what this means is that Africa, this area where I showed you is where it's biodiverse. Africa's got to change in order to produce more food to feed its people. And here is the species abundance map of Africa today, and those are basically in conflict with where we need to start producing food. Already, most people in the world face some sort of water shortage. What you see in the warm colors are the countries and the places on the planet that have serious challenges with providing fresh water to their people. And it's basically everywhere except the northern environments. And so this is only likely to get exacerbated and become worse in the near future. And then, of course, we want stuff. Our footprint on the planet, our consumption is amazing. The more developed places get, the more we want. And what we do is we go to the least developed places to get it. And so this is a picture from the Congo, a picture of where people go to get the coltan for your phones, and do you think they care about the people in those places? And what ends up happening is, in this particular example, it's the land rush, and whether the land rush is for minerals and resources or whether it's for places, for example, in Botswana here, where the Okavango, one of the most remaining biodiverse places in Africa outside of the Congo, there are fences there, and they're fences to keep in cattle that are used for meat in Europe. And so we're not only using the resources there directly, but we're actually taking the food that we want to consume as meat and exploiting the natural areas in Africa. In these exact areas where you see these resources and this land rush, it turns out those are also areas of weakened government, and that means that people can be more easily exploited, and so can their resources. And so this is another kind of synergistic thing that we go into in the book. Weak governments clearly can't take care of their people. This is a picture from Haiti after Hurricane Matthew. Ironically, it's in the same place. It's on Hispaniola, where the Dominican Republic is on the other side of this boundary that runs north-south. They didn't get hit by the hurricane, but they also have a more stable government. And so the important thing here is that governments can really do a lot to buffer environmental change. And in this case, it means societal issues that are overwhelming for weak governments to handle. And that leads us to what we call societal tipping points. And here's where I'm going to hand the microphone over to Tony, and it's at the root of the global migration crisis.
So I'm going to echo what Liz said about being really happy to be here. It's been a fantastic day interacting with everyone. And just to kind of pick up the narrative here, what Liz has shown you is a lot of big problems, right? And we tend to think of these problems as being isolated. But the whole point of complex systems and global interactions is that they're all related. And they come together in ways that tend to be unexpected. And it's human nature being what it is and thinking on the short term, we don't often put the pieces together in the right way to understand what's happened in the past, which means we're not looking in the right way to think about what's going to happen in the future. And I think the global migration crisis is a great example of this. So we think about the migration crisis today, and there are people pouring out of Syria, and that part of the world, into Europe, and we blame it on wars, weak governance, which is absolutely the case. But if you step back and say, what really has to come together to drive these conflicts, it turns out to be three major things. Now, what you're looking at here is a list of countries here, And then the percent population increase in each of those countries is represented by these yellow bars. And here's the global average over the time that's represented here, which is the past 2 decades. So this list of countries is showing you where migrants have been pouring out of for the past 2 decades. And if you read the list, Afghanistan, Western Sahara, Angola, South Sudan, and so on, it's a who's who of war-torn countries, right? One thing they all have in common is population growth rates over the past couple of decades that are 2 to 3 or even more times the world average for the same time. So you're packing a lot of people into geographic areas at a very fast rate. There are also areas that have, for various reasons historically, weak governance, so that's part of it. But then you throw on top of that environmental unexpected events. In the case of Syria and adjoining Iraq, drought that lasted from 2006 to 2011, worst drought that part of the world had seen in about a century. All of a sudden, you've got the 3 individual drivers coming together. Any 2 out of the 3 does not result in the crisis we've seen. You put them all together, though, and all of a sudden, you've got a migration crisis. Interestingly, we tend to think of these things like droughts and the environmental drivers as being local, but again, in the case of the Syrian adjoining regions, that's tied to global climate change, all right? On the left, what farm fields in that part of the world began to look like. On the right, going from 1880 on up to the present, we're seeing basically temperature year by year compared to the global, or the average over that time. These are all global averages. And what you see is actually some classic tipping point behavior. That is, you start out this being the normal state of affairs, then this oscillation, and then boom, you flip into a new state that we're not going to get out of, okay? So it was this flip into the new state that eventually led to increasing intensity of droughts and so on, not only here, but the extreme weather events that Liz has been talking about in her examples. So it's that combination, that interaction, that actually ended up causing the collapse of the Assad regime, creating the vacuum for ISIS to really form, and people began to run for their lives. That's what puts together a global migration crisis. Millions of people in Europe, and we tend to think, oh, that's happening in Europe, but actually, this is happening all over the world now. These are recent, out of the news, okay? Last spring in India, 300 million people moving from the rural areas into the cities. As a result of that, human trafficking ended up increasing, and all the related problems. Liz was talking about water shortages. This person with the gun on their back is guarding the water supply. So these are the things that are happening now. China, resettling ecological migrants in terms of the millions. So the point to be made here is it's not just governance. It's not just population growth. It's not just climate change. It's putting them all together in the same cauldron at the same time. And that's why thinking about how these individual problems become so important. Okay, so this is where we are today. Now, not to just focus on the bad things, okay? Because if you think about what's happened over the past 50, 60 years, I mean, lifespans have increased overall, economic opportunities have increased, we're seeing less child mortality, less hunger, although we still have 1 billion people that go to bed hungry every night. So we've been making these improvements. In recent years, we've begun seeing these increasing conflicts and bad things happening as well. And when we start thinking about global tipping points, what we're really thinking about is, as we go into the future, are we going to tip, so to speak, in a direction where these bad things increase in frequency, or are we going to tip in a direction where they decrease in frequency and the good things get more widespread? And of course, we want to go in the good direction, and we know how to do that, all right? We don't just, I mean, up to now, we have just been letting the future take care of itself. But I think one of the points we'd really like to make is we're past that time. Now we have to start planning the sort of future we want. We have to invent our own future, and to do that, we have to understand how all the pieces fit together. We actually know pretty much exactly how to get to that good future, how to make the bad things decrease instead of increase. And these are sort of the big four, okay? It's stabilized population growth. Clearly, we can't go up that red trajectory Liz showed. But just as clearly, no matter which of those trajectories we follow, we're going to be at 10 billion people by the year 2050. And at that point, it's either going to pretty much level off or it's still going to be going up. But if we're planning for 2050, we have to plan for 10 billion people. Stopping climate change, again, by what Liz showed you, we know we really don't want to go to that place where humanity has never been before. We know how to do that, and I'll give you examples of all these. We have to be more efficient in how we use food and water, and we have to increase global cooperation. I mean, just a few examples there. So population growth. We know how to deal with the population problem. Actually, there's 3 ways that it can go. One of them we don't want to see. One of them is global catastrophes that wipe out a big portion of the human population, where we don't want to go there, obviously. Another is what China tried and worked, the one-child policy. But there's a whole host of ramifications there that made that really not such a good idea, both socially and because of the downstream effects. And then there's what Mauritius tried and worked. About the same time as China was realizing they had a population problem, so did the island country of Mauritius. Their solution was education of women, increasing the ability for everyone to get an education, but particularly focusing on women, providing access to contraceptives for those who wanted them. And the net effect is it brought down birth rates dramatically, and that's been shown time after time after time, which is what you're looking at here, total fertility rate against percentage of girls enrolled in secondary school. And we're not even talking about a high school education in this. A few years of education dramatically brings down fertility rates, increases economic health of the family and physical health of the family. So that's kind of a no-brainer. That population problem can be fixed if we can find the way to motivate the social changes needed to bring education to the right areas. The food problem. We also know that the technology is there to fix that. We can feed 10 billion people by 2050 with a few fixes. One, we throw away about 30% of the food, 30 to 50% of the food that is put on our plates in developed countries. Similar wastage in developing countries, but that's usually from farm to table because of poor transportation, poor food preservation systems. Just by fixing that, we increase food production or availability by some 30% or so. And that's a social problem, right? Eat less meat. That would be huge. If we devoted all of the land we're currently growing corn on to feed livestock to crops that were fed directly to people, that would increase the world's calories or calories for people by some 40 to 50%. Closing the yield gap, being more efficient in areas that are underperforming, but that has to be done in ecologically sustainable ways. From the first green revolution, we've learned our mistakes. We've also learned how to fix them. But that's a social sort of change as well. So, you know, the food thing, most food security experts say it's fixable by doing this. And the climate issue. Now, interesting, you know, if you ask most people in the United States if they think climate change is real and a problem, about 60% of people say yes. If you ask them, is there a solution to the problem? About 82% say, not a chance. It can't be solved because we can't get off of fossil fuels. Well, actually, we can. I mean, the engineers have done the calculations using technology that we have available today. We could largely, well, we could transform both our stationary and our transportation energy systems to be essentially 100% carbon neutral. It's not quite with only the technology we have today. That assumes some advances in battery storage and things like that, but those things are actually happening at a pretty fast rate. We'd have to build a lot of machines, all right? For example, in transforming the stationary system, that's what's involved, big numbers, but those actually aren't such big numbers when you realize what we've already done. Since 1950, for example, well, in the years 1950 to about 1990, we dammed, and I say we, the collective humanity, dammed 60% of the world's big rivers. We paved enough roads in the United States alone to go around the equator twice. Beginning of World War II, that was a great motivator. The United States had no airplane factories. There were about 3,000 planes, and most of them were little biplanes and you know, Cessna equivalents of the day. By the end of the war, through converting car factories to airplane factories, order of magnitude more, 300,000, and fairly sophisticated flying machines of all sorts. So that's what, 5 years, 6 years. These things are doable technologically. We tend to think, well, that's great for the developed world. How about the developing world, though? You know, the richest billion people produce about 60% of the greenhouse gas problem. The poorest 3 billion produce 5% and are still living with 18th century technology. So it is an issue to bring standards of living up to what people want. But they're already doing it in ways we can learn from. Think about cell phones. 6 billion cell phones in the world. Liz showed you the solar panels that people in remote areas are using to charge those. That was a leapfrog. They didn't even bother with the landline infrastructure. Same thing with energy. This is a hospital at the base of Mount Everest. 100% renewable energy, sophisticated operating room, runs on solar, micro hydro. So the point is, it's possible for developed countries to export technology, take advantage of these sorts of things to help developing countries leapfrog over the energy problems they have and end up in a very good place. How much might that cost? Well, here's a calculation for you. That richest 1 billion people, if there was a tax or payment system that on average took $700 per year from that richest 1 billion, that's all the money you need. So these aren't insurmountable. What is appearing insurmountable, at least a day and a half after the election that we had down south of the border, is the social innovation. Really, to accomplish these changes, it's not a technological problem, it's not a scientific problem, it's a social problem. Are people willing to make social changes even when it seems not to their advantage, economically or for some other reason, just for the morality? Well, that answer is yes, too. I mean, think about the abolition of slavery in the United States. That certainly wasn't to a lot of people's economic advantage, but it was the right thing to do. And it was done. Now, not without civil war, and clearly we don't want to go there, but you know, there are other examples of this, too. So the question is, how do we get that social change? We've got a big advantage today because of those 6 billion cell phone, in addition, couple billion internet connections. We are more connected than we've ever been. And this is where the connectivity part of it comes in, the global cooperation. We have the capacity to be globally connected, essentially, you know, one big global brain working on global problems. But how do we get there? I mean, social changes have, you know, they come from many different directions. Both top-down is part of it, that is policies, governments, what they decide to do, but probably more important from the bottom up and people rising to the occasion. Where do we stand at that point right now? Well, you know, if I would have been given this talk 2 days ago, I would have said, and I have said, we've made tremendous progress. And we have. I mean, for example, in climate change, Liz and I have been working on this for 25, 30 years. And in the last 5 years, we saw more movement in fixing that problem, major breakthroughs, you know, 195 nations agreeing that this is a problem they want to fix, setting not a 2-degree target, but even more rigorous target of 1.5 degrees. We had the leaders of the most powerful nations in the world, or the worst emitters in the world, coming together on these issues. We have every major religious leader of every major religion in the world saying this is a problem. That's progress. There are a lot of leaders at the top wanting to do the right thing. Others, not so much, okay? So we are at this kind of point in history right now where it really is going to be up to people at the community and individual level. You know, what happened in the election in the US, if you think about it, on any sort of social issue, common good issue, and this has been shown by a number of studies, you have about 20% of people who say, I'm for the common good and I'm going to help out. Those are the altruists. You have about 20% of people, the so-called free riders here, that say, I'm just in it for myself and I don't care about the rest of you folks. I'm going to do what's best for me. And then you've got people in the middle, about 60% of most populations, that says, well, you know, tell me what the right thing to do is, and I can be swayed. The election in the US ended up being about half and half. It was an information war, right? And the free riders were really effective at getting their message out. The altruists, not so great. So the point being that even though we saw this tipping point in the bad direction, if you look at the actual numbers of people involved, it's about a 50-50 split. I mean, Hillary Clinton actually got the popular vote. So all is not lost, okay? And that's why it's really important to think these changes really do come from us. And they start at a community level, they start at local levels, and then they build. So just as an example of that, I mentioned that 82% of Americans at least say there's no solution to climate crises, or they would say the same for just about any of these other things. Here's a movie clip I'm going to show you. And it's pretty self-explanatory, but basically, this is a documentary that points out how community-based solutions start to make things happen. And I'm just going to run it for you here.
A été publiée il n'y a pas très longtemps une information qui annonce la fin possible de notre humanité.
Climate change, destruction of the Earth's surface, and population growth are leading us to a tipping point.
About 3 years ago, Cyril came to me when I was pregnant and told me about this study. It said that my son would grow up in a world where food, water, and oil will be hard to find.
I was running a non-profit when we met. How could we tell people about what we'd heard when they're already fed up with catastrophes? And how could we tell millions of people?
We had to do something. So we traveled around the globe looking for the men and women who are offering creative alternatives.
It's always so hard.
We didn't start with, shall we save the planet? Because that was too grand. We just start with where we are.
There is no perfect democracy or economic models, but what seemed to emerge from our journey was a new vision for the world, where each community is more autonomous, therefore more free.
En faisant tout à la main sur un tout petit territoire, il peut produire autant qu'avec un tracteur sur un territoire 10 fois plus grand.
San Francisco has an 80% landfill diversion rate. Everything is reduced, reused, recycled, or composted.
See the final show now.
These people are writing a new story. They're saying it's not too late, but we have to get moving. Now.
Now we vote, we govern.
Start looking around, you will get it all. The omens, all the signs.
There are solutions, and if we give it everything we've got, if we all join our forces and hearts, we can all start to change the world. Tomorrow.
In Totnes, we have a £21 note. Kind of 21. Because you can. Why not?
Yeah, because you can. Why not, right? And that's sort of the theme of this movie. What they do is they go around the world actually showing how people are cracking these big problems that we've been talking about at the local level. Okay, that's the key. And it's happening in these totally unexpected places, in totally unexpected ways, not because people want to solve climate change, you know, not because they want to feed the world. It's because they want to have a better life where they are. And I love this example. This is Greensburg, Kansas, at the yellow star there, right in the middle of Trumpland. A few years ago, tornado came through, pretty much wiped out the town. And they said, we're going to rebuild this town totally green, not because we even believe in climate change, but because energy's cheaper, we're more self-reliant, It's just a better way to go. I mean, Texas, south part of Trump land, one of the biggest producers of wind energy in the United States. Not because they don't like oil, but because it's a smarter thing to do in those parts of Texas. So those are the sorts of things that are starting to build, and they magnify in amazing ways. So going into COP21, there was a group of subnational entities, that is, states, counties, municipalities, and so on, that came together as a coalition to say, we're going to do what we need to do in our part of the world, our little local area, to keep our emissions below what, proportionally what we'd contribute to temperature change that would drive us past the 2-degree limit. Well, now that coalition, if you put them all together, you can read the numbers, that's 170 jurisdictions around the world. If you count them as a single entity, that's 1/3 of the world's economy. That's huge. So that's 1/3 of the world's economy moving in the right direction. So, the point being here is we're kind of poised, and we're poised for a different world in the future. And we can either tip towards the right or the left side there, which is a good direction. Things are actually better than today, certainly not worse, or we can go in the other direction, which is sort of where a lot of things have been happening. Which way are we going to go? I wish I could tell you. Here's the way we end our book and the way we'll end the talk, which is, so there you have it. What our heads tell us, i.e. where we're heading if we don't change our ways, and what our hearts desire, which is the good side of that picture. But at the end of it all, reality is going to prevail. And what we know is that the world really is poised to change, to tip in one of those two directions. We know it could go either way, and that we also know the world is running out of time. Our heads tell us, wait too long, and we're just going to have to make do with the bad end game we're given. But our hearts are desperately rooting for the other outcome, the one where the positive things in our world grow and the bad things diminish. In the final analysis, our heads and hearts come together to tell us that the end game we're actually going to see depends not on the path we take alone, but on the path that each of you decides to take as well. And, I hope that the path you decide to take is essentially this one, where you're communicating about the things we've just talked about tonight, where you're communicating solutions, not just problems, where you're recognizing the interconnectedness, and where you're in your own communities, in your own families, in your own way, do what you can to make these things better. That's where it all starts, and that's what will get us to that good world. The other thing is, that movie was entitled Tomorrow. Tomorrow is where we need to get to. Tomorrow is not when we start making the change. We have to start making the change now to get to where we want to get tomorrow. So, that's what we got for you. And we're happy to discuss things today.
So thank you so much for an incredibly stimulating talk. We now have about 15 minutes for questions. And if you see at the front here, we have 2 microphones, one on either side. If I could ask you to just line up behind them, and we'll proceed in order.
Either we answered all your questions or we totally impressed you.
Hello. Thank you very much for both of your presentations. And I'm sorry I'm going to have to ask about the election, and because it's all on the top of our heads. And we know that change is really possible at different scales, municipally, statewide. The not-for-profit sector, private sector are all really getting involved and engaged on addressing, reducing our emissions and adapting to climate change. So do you think the regressive policies that Trump is proposing, and also in terms of having someone head the EPA who's a denier of climate change, I just hope, I guess we're all hoping that that's not really, I mean, we can continue at all those different levels, but do you think that's really going to cause a setback, or how that can be challenged, or hopefully it will be challenged?
So I don't know if I fully understood everything you were saying. There's a lot of echo, but I understood enough to know that I can't predict exactly what they're going to do, who's exactly going to lead different parts of the U.S. government. And I'm not the only one that's in this situation. I mean, we're still in shock. I mean, I haven't fully processed it myself, and you know, grief has many stages. And I mean, you know, devastated is the word that, I mean, we were speechless. And I have to go back and talk to my students, engage with my colleagues, get back into my community, talk again to, I mean, just on Tuesday morning, Election Day, I had someone from Governor Brown's office. You saw Governor Brown. He's been a big partner of ours. He's an amazing progressive leader. He's talked to President Xi, Obama, to everybody he talks about these issues. And so he was in my class, and when we started to see these, you know, results, I direct messaged him and said, you know, what's going on? And he's like, I don't know. He's headed off to Marrakesh. We were headed here, and he's going to COP22. So I don't even know what all the fallout is. So the other way of thinking about this for me is, you know, I do the math in my head, and it looks terrible. So it's kind of what Tony ended on. The head is terrified. The heart, I just have to get up and get back on the horse. I mean, I know that's my destiny, that's my future. I mean, I don't know about all this stuff. You know, I'm happy when I'm in the backcountry working, you know, in the field far away from people, and yet here I am, right, communicating in my best way, and as I'm bearing witness to what I see. And so my heart says, just keep doing it. I'm going to figure out new ways to do it. I'm definitely not doing the same thing. I'm not writing another book like this. It'll be another one. But I am going to keep trying to do whatever I can in whatever way I can. And I'm talking to everybody outside of academia that I can, conveying, trying to find out where they're coming from, learning about those audiences, and trying to find out how I can change their mind view, not just to try and get them to believe about climate, but shifting their perspective about the future. Because it's completely true, we have to start inventing something, and we're not good about inventing futures. We have to change that. So I don't know if I really addressed your question. Maybe you want to take it, Tony?
Sure. Yeah, so, I mean, as I understood the gist of your question, it's basically, now that Trump is going into office, are we going to see lots of rollbacks and really terrible things happen? And I guess the short answer is probably yes. But I think that doesn't mean that all is lost, okay? So what we've seen actually is tremendous progress over the last 8 years, and particularly the last 5 years. What we're going to see now, and what I think we're going to see, nobody can predict Donald Trump, clearly. But based on the fact that we've got him for president, Republican House and Senate, who have wanted to roll back everything Obama has done, but have not been able to, I think we're going to see a lot of rollbacks. I think that, yeah, the climate change, what the United States does for climate change in the name of climate change that's not going to happen anymore. I think, well, so all right, is there hope? Well, yeah, so I think that where there are rays of hope is, again, 50% of the country wants to see those things, actually probably a little bit more. So even though those rollbacks are probably going to take place, I think they're going to be temporary. Now, the big danger is we don't have several decades to solve this problem, so every year lost is critical. But I don't think we're totally doomed. I think we've had a major setback.
So I want to just jump on one more thing that Tony said, and that is, we talked about this today, is that it's not quite 50%, right? Because only 50% of people voted. So the other thing is that Trump is so, his actions and the actions of his cabinet and that government, unless there's something completely unexpected, they're likely to be so inflammatory for the rest of the country that we may see some sort of galvanized, population act more. I mean, I don't know why we had such a low voter turnout. I don't understand it. But whether it's apathy, I have no idea. But I have a feeling that something will change because of that. So that's a hopeful thing.
And I just wanted to add that there is so much momentum already, like you mentioned, at the municipal, at the state, with all different actors already, that can still continue. And that also happened in Canada before we had our federal government change last year. We operated without federal leadership, so we can still move forward. So thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Hi there. Thank you for the speech. It was quite illuminating, and loved a lot of the points that you touched on. I'm trying to pull everything together, so if this question's not great, I'm sorry. But thinking on the need, so population growth will tend to occur in Africa up towards 2050, and you touched on the fact that the agricultural lands that they've currently grown and used are kind of no longer arable, and they'll need to find alternate ways to produce food. So I'm just wondering if the book kind of deals with the nexus that is agricultural production with the large consumption of water that that occurs from it, along with the fact that so that'll then likely lead to drought because of shifting water, areas of evapotranspiration, all of that, along with the likely technological electronic requirements out of it, and then the to get to that high grade agricultural production and the negative impacts of that technology.
So I just want to briefly say food is water. We export a lot of food in California. We have a water problem. We're exporting our water. And a lot of the power in our state, not for transportation, but a lot of the power in our state and around the world is used to move water. So the power, the energy connection is also tied to water.
Yeah, and that's where the point about sort of a green revolution 2.0 that makes use of sort of the best practices that we learned the first time around, but gets rid of the wasteful and polluting practices. So, now we actually have the technology to deliver just the right amount of water to a crop, just the right amount of fertilizer, so there's not this huge wastage. And by saving that wastage, by preventing excess fertilizer application so that it doesn't end up in waterways, it becomes possible to do what we need to do without the environmental devastation and without running out of water, according to the food security people who have looked at this. It's actually not my area of expertise, so I won't speak definitively, but virtually everything I've read on those topics in the highly peer-reviewed literature, does point to that as a solvable problem by using the so-called Goldilocks strategy.
Thanks for your question.
Hi there. Thank you for your presentation. I really appreciate the perspective that you shared with us tonight. My question is, do you have any advice or strategies or ways to incentivize those folks that weren't in the altruism category? How do you mobilize them over to the other side? Everybody has different perspectives. I think you called them, I can't remember. I had it on my picture. Conditional cooperators. I like that. And the free riders. How do we mobilize them over there? You mentioned having the importance of a planetary perspective earlier, and I really like that. How do we get them to think like that?
So I'll just briefly respond. We could talk about this for a long time, and I'll let Tony give a shot at it too. And I think the very first thing is you got to know who you're talking to. You're right, everybody is different. They all have different perspectives. What I'm going to say to my family is going to be really different from what I'm going to say to my classroom, is what I might say or do at a state or national or international level. So knowing your audience is important, and that means you have to be empathetic. You have to understand their viewpoint. So creating a dialogue, so just starting these conversations is sometimes the hardest thing. I'll just upfront tell you all, without any, embarrassment, is that families are the hardest. So they're the hardest because when you're communicating with your family, as you probably all know, it's very rarely just about what your words are saying. There's a lot of baggage. And so just give up on that if that's particularly challenging for you. But go the next step, so really, everybody laughs, but it's absolutely true. Families are the hardest. There's too many other things at stake. But go out the next step, your friends, your neighbors, the person you're sharing the bus with, somebody who's reading a newspaper article. So I'd say those conversations will teach you a lot. And the unexpected conversations you have with people think differently than you are sometimes the most valuable. And not just because you learn more about their perspective, but often if you can shift your message, even though you're not changing what you believe, if you can shift the way you talk, you often can shift their perspective tremendously.
Yeah, so just a couple of things. So one, something Liz said about families reminds me of a great statistic I heard last week, which is, and this was about climate change, but if you're communicating to the general public about climate change, surprisingly, the most trusted source of information are scientists. So I said, great, I'm a scientist. But then the next clause in the sentence was, except for your family and closest acquaintances, who are going to judge you on other things. So yeah, absolutely true. And I think that it's just all in how you frame the conversation. I mean, you're going to, what you really want to do is look for common ground with whoever you're talking to about these issues. And in Texas, it might be the economic benefits of wind power. In California, in coastal areas, it might be something about infrastructure because there's been so many storm surges lately. So you have to tailor it to whoever you're talking to and try to get their perspective on where they're coming from, and offer reasonable solutions, but not expect that your reasonable solutions are going to carry the day. It's really making that personal connection and establishing the relationship.
I want to thank you very much for your talk. I think it brings together a lot of things and really underlines the importance of interdisciplinarity in solving these problems. I'm a psychologist, and one of the things that I do research on is how do you communicate when you're preaching to the choir, which is probably most of this room, versus everyone else. And I was really interested in what you said about the free riders got their message out and the altruists didn't. So I struggle a little bit with these two sides, right? So on one hand, I really agree that you do things at the local level and you get these movements started and people see how it's possible. But at the same time, I think there has to be something bigger, right? Where people say no to a political system and no to some of this other stuff. A couple of things, I don't want to say Trump's name any more than necessary, but a couple of things in this particular cycle that seem really potentially useful. One is that the sustainable energy is often local, and it produces jobs in the place where it is, right? That's something he messaged on a great deal. Another thing that he spent a lot of time talking about was not being in the pockets of big industry, right? And that's actually one of the real problems with the Republican Party and its ties to the oil industry and lobbyists and all of this stuff. So if those two messages somehow could get out, from the altruists to say, this is actually something that could help you and you could still stay within your tribe. I think that there'd be something really interesting about that. I think that the term climate change is just a trigger word for too many people. Yeah, and it's clear you already know that. Yeah, I'm interested in your thoughts on that, but it's one of those things that seems like, I don't think very many Trump supporters voted on climate change. It wasn't an issue that people were voting on, right? So it could be a place where there still is hope.
So a couple of things. I mean, it really helped me to see that most people on social issues have these kind of fall into these categories, because you realize, should your goal be to get everyone on your side? I mean, that's silly. I mean, nobody agrees on everything. So, except everybody wants a good life. They want to be loved and they want to love. And so that fundamental kind of quality of people is a good thing to have in your mind, when you approach a conversation that you think might be difficult. And, everybody says it in different ways. Everyone puts their pants on in the same way and stuff. But I think fundamentally people do want to love and be loved. Stories help a lot. And a story so we have like 21% now of the US energy is sustainable. I mean, that happened not because people were pushing it. It's just kind of slowly happening. In California, we have the most strident environmental laws. I talked about this today earlier, and that happened at the same time. Our state is now become the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. The aggressive kind of legislative kind of changes that have gone in place now for 2020 and then 2030 are so aggressive, and interestingly, they depend on in-state production of sustainable energy, not counting nuclear or hydro. So we're not talking about depending on other states' energy production. The reason why that worked is because the Republican side, the right side of the California senators and congresspeople, all wanted the jobs to stay in the state. And so that argument about sustainable development and shift to off fossil fuels was all about incentivizing job production. So that's another kind of argument, another story that completely is exactly what you were saying.
Yeah, and I mean, the way that ends up scaling up is, so California actually is part of something called the Pacific Climate Pact, and that's with California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, okay? And in that pact, it's really all about developing green energy for job growth, and that's sort of the bottom line. Let's collaborate on making jobs in a sound economic environment. Same thing, California has a similar agreement with China. Okay, that's all about development of green technologies for jobs. I mean, climate change in that case is sort of the excuse for getting together, but you could just as easily flip it and just forget about the climate change part of it.
Sorry, I'll try and keep it quick. I know we've talked a lot about the public sector today, and you guys talked a lot about how governance can affect these issues, but I was wondering if you guys saw any role for the private sector to play, and I think since you're from California, it's a great incubator for both public and private, so where do you think private comes in, and where do you think it balances with the public sector solving these issues?
Yeah, I think the private sector is really super important, and there are, in fact, we tend to think of corporations as the bad guys, and a lot of times they are. But actually, a lot of Fortune 500 companies take these sorts of issues very seriously. There's a group of about 200 companies. These are the world's richest corporations. By the way, most of them have an annual GDP that's more than most countries. And they banded together in this group called the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which has as its goal, something like an environmentally sound world that supports 9 billion people. I don't quite remember the quote, but one of the things they've done is a subset of these corporations, and these are the big guys. Subset of about 20 of them have gotten together and developed this plan called the Vision 2050 plan. And in this plan, it's actually the CEOs of the companies that meet. Matter of fact, you can only get invited to be in this group by another CEO, and you don't send a representative, it's the CEO themselves. So they've had these workshops that lay out what's the path to 2050 that's going to get us to be off of fossil fuels. It's going to be able to get us to produce enough food, raise standards of living throughout the world, and still allow them to make money. Okay? And they've laid it out decade by decade with milestones, and they actually hit almost everything we talked about. So there are people in high places that really take these issues to heart. Not all companies do that, obviously, but just to say that the private sector is super important in getting us there.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the excellent questions, and thank you again to Liz and Tony for such a wonderful talk. So copies of Tipping Points for Planet Earth, or Tipping Point rather for Planet Earth, are available outside, and Tony and Liz have kindly agreed to stick around for a little while to sign them and also to chat with you in case you have any further questions you'd like to ask. But for now, let's please give a warm round of applause to Liz and Tony. Thank you so much.